All right, I am going to introduce our next chair. Rebecca Wells will be chairing our next panel session. She's the Chief Executive of the Mallee Regional Innovation Centre, which is based up in Mildura. And she's going to introduce the guests and run the next session. So over to you, Rebecca. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Sarah. We're going to get started. So we've got some really interesting stuff that we want to talk to you about today, which I think is a really nice lead on from this morning's session that we've had already. I think everyone's probably connected online. They've had a little bit of time to do that, so I think we'll probably get into it. So, as Sarah said, my name's Rebecca Wells. I'm the CEO of the Mallee Regional Innovation Centre. The centre is headquartered in Mildura, and we're the lead for the Northwest Irrigated Horticultural node of the Victoria Drought and Innovation Hub. So today I've got the pleasure of being the chair of our panel discussion, which is enabling communities to engage with science for successful adaptation for drought. And as part of today, you'll be able to ask questions, so we'll be having some online opportunities and from the audience as well. So encourage those online to put your questions into the platform, and we'll try and get through as many as we can. So it seems appropriate today that we're having this discussion around enabling communities to engage with science for successful adaptation to drought. We know that science plays such a critical role, and in this context of looking to the future and what we need to do, science will have that direct role and impact on successful adaptation to drought. Science really spans, across the adaptation lens, and that lens, as we've already seen this morning, has many influencing factors. What will be our short-term actions, our long-term actions, but how will they complement each other? Can we give confidence in the lens of risk appetite? And with that, where are the opportunities? We'll be hearing terms like this, and there's also action-orientated research. So there's lots of new things coming forward in these discussions that we're having. But importantly, I've been asked a number of times too, where's the social science? And we're going to have some of that in our panel discussion today. So how do we ensure that all voices and values and interests of our community are considered? How do we understand vulnerability? We know from our work in the Drought Hub, with the Drought Hub team, that there's challenges in regions and across regions. And, we're looking to learn from each other and work together. We know the importance of place-based and fit for purpose. And with that, what can be a little bit different between regions, even though it's similar? And how do we encourage ownership of outcomes? We know collaboration and co-design are going to be key. So bringing us together today under that collaborative banner, we're going to hear from 3 speakers with a range of expertise. So I think we're in for a really great conversation. So with that, I'll do some introductions, and then I'll get Ben to come up and do his presentation. But to start with, to introduce you to Ben, so Ben Latham is a policy advisor for the Victorian Council of Social Services, specialising in emergency management and climate change. Before joining the community sector, he developed policy and communication strategies for the Western Australian Government and worked as a freelance journalist in the ACT. We'll get to hear about the VCOSS, the Victorian Council of Social Services, and the work that they're undertaking. And this widens that circle of discussion today, and we'll definitely be bringing in that social science element. We've also got Professor Rebecca Lester. Just looking outside, it's pouring rain in case you're getting any other noise coming through on the feed today. So joining us today is Professor Rebecca Lester. So Rebecca is the Knowledge Broker Lead for the Victoria Drought and Innovation Hub, and she's also the Director for the Centre for Regional and Rural Futures at Deakin University. And you may have heard her on the radio yesterday speaking about today's event. So Rebecca specialises in integration of knowledge to create new understanding. Her scientific background is in the management of ecosystems, particularly how best to manage ecosystems for human uses as well as environmental benefits, and in understanding the likely future of climate impacts. She specialises in developing and using knowledge to have real impact in regional communities. She's also passionate about regional development in Victoria, and she's got some projects that she's working on in the Murray-Darling Basin that look at social, cultural, economic and environmental values. The third panel member we have today is Professor Richard Eckard. So Richard is a Professor and Director of Primary Industries and Climate Challenge Centre at the University of Melbourne. His research focuses on carbon farming and accounting towards carbon neutral agriculture, managing extreme climate changes and options for agriculture to respond to climate change. In 2021, Richard was named on Reuters' list of the world's 1,000 most influential climate scientists and appointed a Fellow of the Australian Academy of Technology, Sciences and Engineering. Richard is a science advisor to the Victorian, Australian, New Zealand, United Kingdom and European governments and the International Livestock Research Centre and the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organisation on Climate Change, Adaptation, Mitigation and Policy Development. He's also a member of the Victorian Agricultural and Climate Change Council. So you can see we've got an amazing list of expertise coming together in this panel session that we're going to have. So to start with, I'm going to hand over to Ben and he'll give you a short presentation and then we'll move on and we'll get to some questions and tell you a few more things about what they've been up to. So thanks, Ben.
Thank you, Rebecca. Yeah, it's pouring outside for people online. It reminds me of a heatwave forum at VCOSS that we held last year where it hit about 15 degrees that day. But I think it shows it's really important to have these conversations during good times so we've actually got time to take action. I'll be quick. Rebecca said I won't get any lunch if I go over my time with my presentation. But for people who don't know Victorian Council of Social Services, we represent the community sector in Victoria. So that might be disability advocates, housing supports, family violence services. They represent community members and often during times like drought, their services experience extreme demand. So they see the impacts of climate change firsthand through the community members who need their services. I thought today would be useful to talk about a project VCOSS undertook last year and is continuing in the second stage this year, essentially where we undertook a listening tour across Victoria. So the focus was the recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic, but all of these different discussions across the state really showed us what resilience is. People started talking about the bushfires, they started talking about flood and drought, heat wave. They talked about all different events in their communities. They even talked about the war in Ukraine and the death of Shane Warne. And it was really quite confronting seeing how people's resilience was really being whittled down. So I think when we're talking about drought, it's, I guess, important to think about all of these different events that are affecting people and the compounding impacts that are affecting everyone. A benefit of the listening tour and working through trusted community organisations was the fact that we got to speak with quite a diverse range of voices, including people experiencing disadvantage, people whose voices aren't often heard in policy debates. And we got to talk to them about what they needed for a good life and what they need to feel resilient to things like drought. It was quite obvious things like people needed income, they need a roof over their heads, but thinking about Nina's presentation, it was also a lot about social connections. People were feeling quite isolated. So it gets me thinking about drought and how important it is to have these community connections so people have people they can lean on, and then they've also got access to information as well. And the panel will also be talking about communication and engaging communities. The listening tour is perhaps an example of how that community engagement can be done, making sure that we hear from not the usual voices, but instead going to community organisations that have got these real deep, trusted links with different people in the community. Not just putting information up online and hoping people read it, but actually going into these different community groups where they can have these really important, deep connections with people to teach them about climate adaptation and the impacts on them and their families, and including how we can prepare for drought. But I'll just leave it there and pass back to Rebecca. She's got us very well drilled.
Well, thanks, Ben. I should have mentioned too, Professor Lester's actually joining us online today, so she'll be presenting remotely. So I'm going to hand over to Rebecca next so that she can present. Thanks, Rebecca.
Thanks, Rebecca, and I'm sorry I wasn't able to join you all in person today. As Rebecca mentioned, my research is fundamentally about what the impacts of climate change will do to the things that we value within ecosystems and within communities. And so I thought it might be helpful to start the conversation today with a bit of an exploration about what some of the types of science that I do look like and how they're actually able to be used by policymakers and by communities to have an impact. So just going to give a few examples of some of the work that we have done. And of course, while I'm drawing on my own research here, there are so many more examples of good science that is informing our policy and that we need to continue to make sure that happens. So this first piece of work here is looking at what is the impact of management. So this is a piece of work that we did with the Commonwealth Environmental Water Holder, where we're able to assess what differences the environmental watering that they're undertaking might make to the ecosystems that they're attempting to maintain or restore, and then to be able to extrapolate that in space and time to be able to compare to a watering scenario to a no watering scenario. And that provides the ability to quantify the benefits that are associated with that particular management action in that case. We also develop tools that can facilitate decisions. So this was a piece of work that one of my master's students undertook, and he's developed an interactive online tool that enables farmers in the Corangamite CMA region to be able to look up their own properties and to be able to see what happens if they are interested in fencing off their riparian zones. So it enables you to choose the width of your riparian zone and to be able to adjust that, and then provides the costs and benefits associated with that. So we've included fencing costs and revegetation costs, but then we've also got things like the amount of carbon sequestration that we expect to generate with planting out that riparian zone, and what the change in the production for that particular property might be. So these types of tools enable people to have more information to make the best decisions that are appropriate for their own circumstance, and to understand how these types of things will actually affect them personally on their own property. And so that's a bit of a similar scale to what Rob was talking about earlier this morning with some of the work that he does. We also actively investigate what are the attributes of freshwater systems that could contribute to adaptation. And so this is a little piece of work that we were doing to investigate the possibility that freshwater plants and algae may actually be an alternative to the reasonably well publicised red seaweed to feed to cattle to be able to reduce their methane emissions, for example. And while it's pretty early days for that work, I can suggest that the impact is not quite as stark. The Asparagopsis seaweed is extremely effective, but there are some plants and algae that do have quite useful impacts, and so that's hopefully something we'll explore a bit further. Rebecca also mentioned that I'm pretty passionate about regional development, and so understanding how we're actually able to take some of this knowledge and this science and translate that into changes in communities, and to make those communities more sustainable through time, and to have a sustainable economic base as well as a social and environmental base as well. And then finally, quite a bit of the work that we do is looking at what future climate projections could be. What do we expect temperatures to look like? What do we expect rainfall and therefore stream flows to look like? And then how is that going to be able to support or not support the various different organisms or the community values or the economic values that we have within those systems? And how effective are some of the adaptations that we would choose to be able to address those impacts? So that provides us both with the ability to understand which adaptations may be most effective, but also to see whether there are synergies or trade-offs between areas that can sometimes be thought of as being in competition with each other. Whereas I think we really need to start to think about the community, the environment, the economy as being synergistic and working together. So I might hand back to you, Rebecca, and leave it there for the minute.
Great, thanks, Rebecca. So next I'll pass over to Richard.
Thanks, Rebecca, and thanks everyone. We've only got 3 minutes apparently, so what we do if we've only got 3 minutes, can I get the next slide, or does the clicker work? No? While we wait for it to come up, When you've only got 3 minutes, you just put a map up. So there's my map. While you pore over the details of the map, it kind of aligns with the previous speakers who said there's a general southward movement of our weather systems. I mean, Caroline's data shows that step change. And I've heard the term millennium drought talked about a few times, and let me give you a bit of a background. The climate scientists are so beaten up by the naysayers that actually they need 30 years worth of data before they actually use terminology like a step change in our weather. So we haven't had 30 years since the beginning of the millennium drought. We are now just starting to see the Bureau of Meteorology officially say the millennium drought never ended. There were just a few La Niña events punctuated in the last 20 years, but actually what we've seen is a step change, same as we had in Western Australia in the 1970s, a step change, which is why Cape Town ran out of water. Same thing happening in Victoria, a southward movement of about 400 to 800 kilometres of our weather systems. We've mapped that as well. So if you apply that to Victoria, and Rob was part of some of this logic originally in saying, well, how would Victoria change? You'd have to say, well, we're already seeing a southward movement of canola, for example. Hamilton used to be prime sheep country. It's now a lot of canola going in there. More viable for cropping because it's dried out. What's happening is mixed farming system is moving back up into the traditional cropping because you can't keep going with too many crop failures in the northwest. You've got to actually mix up the farming system. We've seen the Brown Brothers example of moving Pinot Noir grapes to Tasmania and buying up the Guns plantations. That was a climate change action. They just worked out that by 2030 you can't produce quality Pinot in Victoria because of temperature. We've seen dairy contract. Tasmania has not lost the idea that it's prime dairy country now. They're actively promoting the fact that they're better than Victoria as prime dairy, and we've seen a contraction of dairy to the more reliable rainfall zones. So things are changing, and we need to be ready for that. And we probably in our minds need to start thinking about step change versus drought. They're connected. Climate change is connected to drought because it does mean a drop in growing season rainfall, but an increased frequency of extreme events, which would be days like today coupled with drought. There are some winners as well, if you think about it, because if you've got a southward movement of weather systems, you're starting to get more summer rainfall in northeast Victoria. You're starting to get more summer rainfall come around into the Orbost area. So grasses like Kikuyu are going gangbusters in those areas because they're getting the summer rain. So it's taking an intelligent view of the landscape and saying where are the opportunities that we should change to versus where are some of the changes we need to adapt to. So thank you.
Making me out to be a hard taskmaster. I'm not really. Excellent. Well, we've got some opportunity now to have some Q&A, but we thought I'll invite Richard and Ben to come and sit up. We've got Rebecca online. We're going to start off. I've got a few questions I thought I might just start us off, and then we can come to the audience. So, Rebecca, I'm actually going to throw to you for the first question. And, you know, I think this feeds in nicely with some of the stuff that you've mentioned, and I guess will help set the scene a bit more for our discussion today as well. So climate change, we know, is one of the greatest challenges of our time, and communities will need to adapt to remain viable. The extreme climatic events we're having, and today more specifically, we're here talking about drought. And amongst the challenges, you know, I think it'd be good to talk about the opportunities. What are the opportunities for community, and what are you seeing?
Thanks, Rebecca. As you say, and as has been highlighted already, there are going to be many challenges as a result of both drought and climate change, and there's quite a lot of uncertainty about how that is going to eventuate. We know that southeastern Australia is likely to be hotter and drier, and we have all seen evidence of the type of variability that is going to become increasingly frequent in the floods, the droughts, the fires that we've had in the last 5 years. But there's also a saying about never wasting a good crisis. And so climate adaptation provides us with the opportunity to rethink how our regional communities operate. So traditionally, our communities have often had a single or maybe two focal industries. That's often agriculture, perhaps mining. And in many cases, we've seen trends of people tending to leave regions. Factors such as global commodity prices, water reform, climate variability have tended to increase the variability of those regional communities. So knowing that we're facing these challenges, we're really working towards being able to address these and to make our communities more sustainable into the future. So renewable energy, for example, is a really wonderful opportunity because It provides farmers with additional income streams. It provides the opportunity to be able to attract our energy-intensive industries into regions and to diversify that economic base. And it also provides us with the opportunity to grow our manufacturing base, which we know during COVID we would have liked to have seen more onshore manufacturing and perhaps some slightly less disrupted supply chains. So value-add opportunities exist for commodity-driven agriculture, and we'd like to be able to take advantage of the wonderful quality of Australian produce and to be able to find competitive advantages arriving from that quality. So by developing local innovation precincts, for example, in regions is one way that that can be achieved, by identifying a location for a concentrated and coordinated investment that would bring together all of the resources that was needed by such industries. So that could be renewable energy, high quality, high reliability water, logistics, transport links, access to innovation partners via connections with universities and other research providers. And so that is likely to drive local investment into a sector that fits in the existing identity of that region. So in short, I think there's a huge opportunities that can come with the challenges of adaptation to climate change and to drought if we're able to approach that thoughtfully.
Right, thank you. That's a lot to unpack there. So start to think about, what your questions might be. So I think that now naturally leads me for a question to Ben and bringing a bit more of that social science element into the discussion today. So we know VCOSS, the Victorian Council of Social Services, has undertaken a lot of activity, and you mentioned the listening tour. How do we ensure that climate adaptation is equitable and the benefits, people experiencing and those that are disadvantaged?
Yeah, thank you. Just going up from what Rebecca was talking about, it does feel sometimes like climate adaptation is all about avoiding the doom and gloom, but we are talking about a big investment of resources, a big changes in the way we think and how systems are structured. So coming from that equity lens, we know that there are inequalities in society, but climate adaptation is that opportunity to make people's lives better, not just making sure that people's lives don't get worse. We know with climate change, like the COVID-19 pandemic, that it's people experiencing disadvantage who are more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. That could be due to income, housing quality, age, medical conditions, a whole range of different things. I think at VCOSS, when thinking about the impacts of climate change, we think about vulnerability in terms of people's sensitivity, their exposure and their adaptive capacity. So I think when thinking about drought, it's really important to think about who's most exposed, who's most sensitive, and then who has least amount of resources to prepare for drought, respond and recover. And then that way, I think we can really target our climate adaptation investment on the people who are most impacted and need the most assistance to cope with these climate change impacts. But as Rebecca was saying, it does feel like a really great opportunity. We've talked about mental health and resilience, but if we're able to put in more resources into mental health counselling and community health, for example, there's a potential here that people will have better access to mental health supports than they did to begin with. So food security comes up a lot. A lot of our members are investing in community gardens, for example, or teaching community members how to grow fresh and affordable food in their backyard. So, yeah, there's definitely positives to take out of this. And I think if we take that equity lens, while adapting to climate change, we can also address quite entrenched disadvantage across Victoria too.
Thanks, Ben. That's great. Get us thinking about that wider picture and the importance of that diversity in the conversations we're having. I think then, Richard, my question for you then is probably around research, knowing that that's the field that you're coming from, and we are actually have scientific panel discussion here today for this panel. Where do you see the research challenges in assisting farmers adapting to the changing climate?
So this is a tricky one because I've been involved in this area of research for more than 18 years. And as a biophysical scientist who likes numbers and tangible stuff, I've had to come to the conclusion adaptation in agriculture is about people making decisions. It's about farmers choosing to act on the evidence they've got. And the best we can do in research is come up with a smorgasbord of options for farmers to choose from when they are ready to adapt. So actually it keeps the social science theme going in our discussion here, that actually adaptation is primarily about people making decisions to adapt and what those triggers are. And I'm reminded of the beginning of the Millennium Drought. About 2 years before that, we had a forum in the dairy industry in northern Australia, in northern Victoria, where we presented climate change and said, these are the things you need to do. Stop pouring water on summer irrigated pastures, go to strategic irrigation of lucerne in winter. And no one was ready to take on the message. 2 years later, there was almost a 80% adoption of that message because the trigger had come.
Yes.
But what was possible is the decision to make the change was there because research had done the research to deliver the solution. So I don't want to display the biophysical, but it's almost easy. If you've got a bunch of agronomists in a room, we could actually come up with 20 solutions for every occasion. Just which one the farmer's going to adopt, we don't know.
Yes, and I think, it's really interesting you touched on that point of decision making. So we know across the Victoria Drought Hub that decision making has come up as one of the key issues. So Sarah mentioned some things that have come up across the hub at the beginning today, mental health. So decision making and strategies and trigger points is something that's definitely come up and something that we've been looking at as well. So I've just noticed we've started getting some questions coming in, which is exciting. I'm just going to start off with one online, and then I've got one down the back in the audience already. So we've actually got a question about soil health, function and regenerative practices, and the potential of soil management, in terms of what we're talking about today. So thank you for that question that's been put forward. So just as a bit of a point so that everyone's aware as well, with the Victoria Drought Hub, we do have a soil coordinator that is part of the Drought Hub, so Dr. Peter Fisher. So he's not here today, unfortunately, but there is a really strong connection in terms of that linkage that we have with that, because we all know how important soil is. But I think, Rebecca or Richard, is there anything that you wanted to further add to that question about soil management?
Rebecca?
I can take that one. It's a really active area of research. I think there is a lot of different options that are being put forward as potentially being able to assist with soil health and soil management. And I think quite a lot of recognition that some of the practices that we have had in the past have perhaps tended to deplete that soil health. So lots of interest in turning that around. Some of the current work that we are undertaking at the moment within my centre, for example, is looking at different types of things that you can add to soil to be able to improve that health. And some of the examples that we're actively exploring at the moment are the use of chicken manures instead of other types of fertilisers, to be able to have perhaps a more natural fertiliser that hopefully is also using a waste product from another industry. We're also looking at some more unusual things like flour from glaciers, so that kind of crushed rock that turns any glacial stream that beautiful light blue colour. And then finally, we're also investigating some of the green waste products, things like the green waste that gets collected from the roadside outside your home, but also sludges from wastewater treatment plants and other things. And to be able to look at how adding those into soils can increase microbial health and try to protect the ability of those soils to be productive.
Could I make a comment on that as well? There's something I tend to sort of rant about quite a lot, is that we've got into the ditch of talking about soil carbon because the fossil fuel industries think we can bail them out. And we lose sight of what really matters to farmers. That's soil organic matter, not soil carbon. If you want soil carbon, burn it all and stick it in the soil as charcoal. There's no benefit to the soil. But if you want soil health that it gives better drought resilience, then you build soil organic matter, not soil carbon.
Thank you. We're going to a question down the back there. Francine.
Yeah, thanks. Look, I'm not sure whether I'm here as what type of stakeholder I am, because I'm a farmer, but I'm also an academic. But so I'm speaking as a farmer here, and mainly to Richard. And I think that I've been listening, and not once today have we heard about water trading and the market. And we've also got nobody here, as far as I can tell, from Golden Murray Water. And we know that from the map that you showed, the movement of the dairy down into the cooler regions. Now, every man would have wanted to open up a dairy in either Tasmania or in the water-rich areas down there. They just don't have the money. And that was the whole point of the irrigation system. And it also democratised farming for this region. Now, I think that there are various parts of the northern irrigation plains areas that are well past the tipping point, and that they can no longer, the customers can no longer sustain the infrastructure. So most of the areas, the dairies around our area, are now closing, and the small ones are. And so they're being replaced by big mega farms. And we're seeing some terrible outcomes of that. Now, some of it's really efficient, particularly water efficient. So we can rip out all of the paddock trees and we can put in travelling irrigators, and we've got the drip irrigation systems and all that sort of thing. But the decision making that you're talking about is entirely market-based. And all of that water has headed to the almonds down in the Sunraysia. Now, these are decisions made under constraint. So they're not really decisions informed by the long-term prospects of the farm or the farming communities. And that's the huge elephant in the room. So I really want to know how that fits in with this wider research.
A very tricky question, because the governments of the day believe market forces should dictate, and that governments don't dictate land use. It's only in command economies where that takes place. So we kind of stuck with market forces which give you skewed outcomes. I don't know. I'm not a water expert either. All I'm showing you is what's happening rather than what should happen.
Unbundling is very recent in our memory as farming, very recent.
Sorry, I didn't hear that.
Sorry, unbundling of water and marketisation of water and the capacity to trade water and separate it from land is the root of all of the infrastructure costing questions that we've got, and that is the source of this major, that's the source of all of the water movement during the drought. And I've read academic papers in which economists say this is the farmers saying that unbundling of water and water trading is good. But this is a decision made under duress. They did not have a choice. We cannot compete. As dairy farmers or as beef farmers, we cannot compete with almond growing, particularly when California was in drought. The prices are completely constructed by international market forces. So we're left with a situation where we're just mopping up. And it's nothing to do with soil health. Of course, every man and his dog would want to be at the Archers farm in Tasmania where they settled as squatters back in...
So, Francine, I'm just wondering, is there a question with this that we can attach in?
I think what I'm really getting is this huge cognitive dissonance for the scientists, because our memories are a lot longer than the sorts of things, and I'm seeing people say that this is old stuff, that the unbundling is irreversible, and that the irrigation system should be closed down. The irrigation systems are the response to drought. That's what they were. So when are we going to see that shift?
I don't know if I can answer that question.
I might take that one if you like, Richard.
All I can tell you is there's a bunch of us in sort of more systems research that don't agree with the economic model because it's got us into trouble in the first place. I don't have an answer.
I think Rebecca's just got a hand up, so to speak.
Sorry, I don't have a virtual hand. I think that's actually a really important point that I wanted to make about potential for maladaptation. And so by maladaptation, I mean changes that perhaps make the situation worse, even though the people who are taking those decisions are trying to address the challenges that they face. And it may be, as your point was, about being under duress, or it may just be that what's right for one person is not actually collectively right for the whole community. And I think there are two main things that we need to think about, one of which is coordination at a local government level and being able to understand what sorts of changes that we want to have within our regions and what sorts of incentives and disincentives are going to lead to those changes. And so you mentioned about irrigation systems. We know that irrigation providers like GMW want to be able to reduce the irrigation footprint and keep a cap on those types of prices. But because of the way the system is set up, all of the big blocks of land that don't have existing infrastructure that may be suitable for new entrants are all on the edges of that system. And so that means that instead of making the system smaller, I guess the maladaptation is that the system may actually be getting bigger The other really important point is that we need to understand what the community wants. We need to know how the community see themselves and see themselves into the future in a sustainable way. We need to make sure that that's the direction that these changes are taking us in, so that we don't end up with a scenario where we have unsuitable investment in regions that is just not where the community wants to be. We want to make sure that we have investments that are appropriate, things that add to the existing character of a region, and that the entrants have a conversation with the community about how do they add value to that community? How do they build their social licence to be involved in that community? And so those are the types of conversations that I think this forum and others should be trying to spark about where do we see our future? How do we see that as being productive? And then we're not going to be completely subject to market forces and to have those types of purely economic drivers when we know that sometimes that takes us down roads that are not where we want to be.
Thanks, Rebecca, and thanks, Francine. It's really good. This is what today is all about, so having these types of conversations. So thank you for that input into today, and thanks, Rebecca, for the response to that. I'm looking at the back of the room thinking we probably nearly have... just one more question, maybe. I'm just looking at the questions we have online here. We've actually got thumbs up for one in particular. So, Richard, I might just throw to you. Ben, you may be able to have something to add to this as well. But there's a question for Richard in particular about how you like to see modelling work on step change extended by the Drought Hub into the hands of regional farmers.
Look, I just say yes. It's pretty clear that we're starting to see the climate science community come out and say we see that Victoria on average lost 100 millimetres since the Millennium Drought hasn't come back. If you leave out the La Nina years, it's pretty clear that's gone. It's really important when you start talking about drought versus our new norm, and how do we prepare for that new norm rather than it's just a drought, we'll get through it. So yeah, I actually think this is something the Bureau of Meteorology should be engaged on to provide that more, clear messages and information. I've only heard 2 presentations from them that actually said this, but it wouldn't come from me. It would have to come from the official source, which is the Bureau.
And then, Ben, do you have a comment on that? I mean, looking at the work that VCOSS have been doing in terms of that, I guess, as Richard's just said, what the new norm is in terms of a phrase, what is it that you're seeing or looking at in response to that change development in the area you're working in?
Yeah, in terms of, this question I think just reflects what Rebecca was talking about too, in terms of engaging community members about what they would like to see within communities. I guess we saw through the pandemic that just sometimes putting information online isn't quite enough. Like people interpret and understand information in different ways. So it's really important that the messages are co-designed with community members to make sure it reflects the local context. And then also making sure too that you're actually working with community leaders and community organisations to get that information out there. I think otherwise there's a real risk that you get people who are engaged on the issue and are across it already, who are the ones who know where to go online and know where to access this information. But it's quite complex what we're talking about. So yeah, I just feel like that community engagement and co-design part of this communication challenge is very necessary.
Thank you. Well, I think that's us done for today for the moment, but there'll be opportunities at lunchtime to catch up for those that are here in the room. Thank you for those online for your questions and in the room too. And if you could just thank a warm welcome to our panellists today.